Welcome back to the Spatial Connection, the podcast where we explore the fascinating journeys of geospatial professionals and dive into the incredible ways location-based technologies are shaping our world. I'm your host, Kelly McGee, and today's guest is Aaron Addison. Maps, locations, connections. For some, they're just lines on a page. However, for Aaron, they were a calling, an obsession that began in childhood and evolved into a career. From his high school map fascination to navigating the complex world of geospatial technology. Aaron's journey is one of unexpected turns, strategic pivots, and a relentless pursuit of advancing GIS. Hydrographic surveying, GIS coordination, and executive leadership. His is a story of breaking new ground in an ever-evolving industry. Join me as we learn how he is working to bring the power of location intelligence to a global stage. Well, welcome, Aaron. I'm glad you were able to come here and be on our podcast today. Kind of excited to have you here. Got a lot of good history to talk about. It's been a while since we've talked. It was kind of nice catching up with you before the show here. So as we, talked before, we're here to kind of give people an idea of what are some of the careers in GIS? How did people get from point A to point B? Along that journey, what did you learn? How did you get there? And, what were some of the thoughts from changing from one position to another, next position? And the other thing I'd like to kind of be able to talk about is how you've seen the technology change, from when you first got involved with geospatial and how it is today, and kind of maybe where you see it going down the line. So with that, maybe you can start off telling us a little bit about how did you first get in, learn about geospatial? Where did you get involved with it? And I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Kelly. Great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. My path to geospatial GIS technology started way back in high school, and probably, if I think about it, even before that. Although it wasn't called GIS, I was the kid who sat around on the floor looking at a Rand McNally atlas, sort of the original Google Maps, if you will, and just thinking about places and thinking about different relationships between things that were on that map. So whenever I got out of high school in the late 80s and started my undergrad at SIU Carbondale, I went into the geography department. I said, this is what I want to do. I want to be a geographer. And somewhere around my sophomore year, I sort of had a mild anxiety attack because I started contemplating, what am I going to do with a geography degree for a real job?
What's the job
and,
like?
Yeah, what's the job market? And this is in the early 90s, like what's the job market for a geographer? And of course, you could always teach geography, but it wasn't really clear what the applications of that were at that time. So I made a quick pivot into forestry, natural resource management, essentially because when I looked at the curriculum, they had courses like photogrammetry and remote sensing and all the things that I was interested in and being outside. And I certainly like forestry as well. So as I looked around though, I thought, well, I could actually get a job in that if I needed to. But something else happened around that same time, and that was that I got a job with a local civil engineering firm. And this firm had a contract with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, specifically to do hydrographic surveying on the big rivers. This at that time was still being done with what's called single beam sonar and plane table survey, if you can believe that. They were using LORAN devices for positioning, and they were plotting it manually on Mylar, and then I was digitizing all the soundings and hand contouring them for the Corps on dredge surveys and hydrographic surveys. So really my introduction to drafting and to mapping came through on-the-job experience at the same time I was getting a degree in undergrad at SIU. And by the time I graduated, I had job offers to be on a fire crew at a national park or something like that. And while I certainly was passionate about that, if I'm honest, I was already making more money working at the engineering firm than I was ever going to make in forestry. And so, fast forward, I worked for several different engineering firms, and then ultimately went to work for a company called Bentley Systems, using their MicroStation software suite for road design and mapping and so forth. And so that was really my introduction and the first third of my career. The first 17 years of my career were in as a practitioner in geospatial. About a little over 20 years ago, I was doing that, and I was quite happy. And Washington University in
And that was
St.
still
Louis.
primarily with microstation?
That was microstation. I taught myself some of the ArcGIS, ArcMap, and even, I guess I really, go all the way back, started with ArcV 3.3 or 3.2.
That's about the time it started
Something
getting
like
really
that.
bit more
Yeah.
involved.
And so I was very aware of those tools, but really, as I started to learn more about GIS, what I really came to realize is that I had been doing GIS, I was just doing it in a CAD environment. And so, once I'd done the hydrography and hydrographic mapping, then I was also doing airport layouts. I was also doing city planning for utilities. I was also doing parcels, plat maps, subdivision layout, like all the things that you would think about when you think about GIS. But GIS graphically wasn't quite there yet, and we were using CAD tools to do that.
And there was still a lot of, from the civil engineering side, that was the mapping
Absolutely.
source for a lot of, especially municipalities and organizations.
Yeah.
They would go to engineering companies and say, hey, we need some maps, and that's where they would go. So you would get that CAD background, which was a big force there.
Yeah. The disconnect, I think, between the two worlds at that time, and this has improved dramatically since then, but the disconnect then was almost all of those projects were done in local coordinates. So they were not tied to the real world in any way, which has obvious downsides if you come from a GIS background.
And that could be project by
It
project.
could be project by project, but you could, if you geo-referenced all your projects, they'd just all be on top of each other because every single project had the same sort of artificial coordinate system. They'd all be at 10,000, 10,000 or
Right.
something like that.
Keep those numbers down small.
The surveyors liked the smaller numbers because they were doing computations by hand in some cases,
Right.
are using very, survey software that did not have a graphic user interface. They were just crunching numbers, doing the math for closing traverse and level loops and things like that. So we needed a way to be able to display all that. And the microstation tools at that time were definitely a way to do that.
It was very powerful software for that.
Still is.
Yeah.
It's incredible. I even go back now and think about the things that I see coming out or coming online in more traditional GIS software that we were able to do in the early 90s with CAD software. And Intergraph was a part of that, and Autodesk was a part of that. And there were a lot of different people working on these problems. They maybe didn't call them GIS or they didn't use that same language, but the concepts and the tools and some of the things that they were doing certainly were there. Whether it's a direct matchup or not, those things were happening and continue to happen to this day.
And I think one of the things is, when people were first starting with the CAD side, is you had there was a lot of data collection in that environment. And back in the day, as you're well aware, GIS was that kind of non-definitive, kind of nondescript boundaries a lot that it started with. It wasn't at that engineering level and getting those discrete boundaries so much. And then you had that merging of the two worlds, and that's probably right around that time frame there.
Yeah, so then there's definitely a convergence. As the big customers for these companies, they have design, they have environment, they have planning, they have all these different functions within a city or within a project. The reality is that you're going to have some GIS, you're going to have some CAD. There are things that are better done in GIS, there are things that are better done in CAD. And that, really using the right tool for the job is what it's all about. It's not, I can do some CAD things in GIS, I can do some GIS things in CAD.
Right.
And that will always be the case, right? And it gets easier, but using the right tool for the job is the real key there.
I think that is the key, the right tool for the right job, or for the job, I should say. So now you put a lot of time into the engineering world. You've done a lot. You worked your way up, and you said that was about 17 years worth that you've kind of worked through this. That puts you around what year would you?
So that brings us up to probably the late 90s, early 2000s.
Okay.
My last big project for Bentley was switching the Indiana Department of Transportation over to MicroStation and their design software for highway design and traffic design. Around that time, I was recruited away to build a geospatial program for Washington University in St. Louis. They had a grassroots effort driven by faculty that had made a recommendation to the provost to hire a GIS coordinator for campus. And through a series of interviews, I was selected to be the first GIS coordinator for the university. I had no budget. I had no resources. I only had an office because the Earth and Planetary Sciences Department took mercy on me and gave me a place to call an office. It turned out to be a really nice office, so I'm very thankful for that. But I didn't really have anything other than a mandate to try to do something with this. And so thankfully, over the next decade, 12, 13 years, I was able to build a team, not only working on geospatial, but also on research data and data analytics for the 7 schools at the university. Along the way, we developed a GIS certificate program. We developed courses around geospatial topics. I developed a curriculum in the School of Social Work and Public Health, taught courses in arts and sciences, and art and architecture, and education, medicine, all these different areas, because we didn't have a geography department at WashU, and that surprises some people, but they don't have one. And as I looked around, and again, this is 20 years ago. It's not what it is today, or it wasn't. And as I looked around, a lot of schools, even schools in the St. Louis region, they might have a geography department, which became the natural home for geospatial. What happens if you don't have that natural home? And so what I came up with is I'm going to turn it inside out, and we'll push geospatial out into all the different use cases rather than trying to bring all the use cases to geospatial. And that turned out to be a reasonably successful model for the university, whether it was on the education side, on the research support side. I was very thankful to be able to work on such a wide range of projects. I might be working on, school lunch program mapping in the morning, and then by the afternoon, I'd work on anthropology, and I was on my way to work on Mars rover trajectories and stuff like that. So very thankful to have that sort of cross-section of experience. My engineering experience and background allowed me to work with our facilities department at the university on mapping out as-built utilities around campus, getting them up with an RTK unit to do real-time GPS on their utilities that the contractors are
help you
working
speak
on.
their lingo a lot.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's one of the things that you learn, no matter what domain you're working in, is that if you want to connect to anthropologists, you learn to speak anthropology. If you want to connect to education and teachers, you learn to speak teacher.
Right.
If you want to, connect to facilities management, public works, you learn to speak public works. And this idea that they have to somehow learn your language is just not very productive. You have to meet, I would say, you have to meet people where they're at, not where you wish they were at.
I totally agree.
And that's sort of the model that we used at WashU.
This change from engineering to the education world, what kind of made you think to go that direction? Was it just the opportunity you saw there and you thought it sounded interesting, or was there kind of a desire earlier on to maybe get into an education?
I think it wasn't any one thing. I wish I could say, hey, aha, there it is. But it really wasn't like that. I think a lot of things were coming together at that time. We both worked in sort of that environment at different times, which can be quite fast-paced. What are you billable on, et cetera. I was, at that time I was looking for, I sort of had felt like I'd done everything I come to do in engineering. So that was maybe the start of it. But certainly going to the university is a change of pace in terms of you don't have to be, there's no expectation that you're billable all the time.
A much different environment.
Very, very different environment. I was interested in being an educator and sort of also the idea that this thing was brand new. And there's an opportunity to build something up from scratch here, which doesn't come along very often.
No, it doesn't.
And I just felt like at that time it was something I couldn't pass up.
Very fortuitous, because you kind of you get to do a lot of things since you've been
Absolutely.
there.
Yeah.
So you get to WashU, and you did WashU stuff for quite a while.
Yeah, that's sort of the middle third of my career. So I was at WashU for 12, 13 years, as I said. And again, towards the end of that, feeling like I had built the thing I came to build, right? And it was time to turn that over to somebody else. And I'd been feeling that, for a couple of years. So before I left the university, I went ahead and got my executive MBA through their Olin School of Business. And again, very thankful for that opportunity because it brings sort of a business dimension to the technical side that I'd been working on for, almost 30 years at that point. So, as you go and you think about asking people for money on projects and stuff whether you're in academia or if in a nonprofit world, if you go and ask somebody for $10 million, they have some expectation you know how to spend $10 million,
Right.
and that they're not just going to be hearing about it on the news whenever something doesn't go the right way. So that was another part of why I wanted to get my MBA to couple to that. But once I left the university, I started my own consulting firm working with state and local government, working with other organizations internationally around the world on strategy, on implementation, on configuration of enterprise environments, and then also on education. And along that way, I met up with a woman named Barbara Ryan, who at that time was the executive director for the World Geospatial Industry Council. And she asked me to come on board and do some consulting. And then over the next year, she sort of cleverly reeled me in and then, made it known she was looking to retire. And I was lucky enough to interview and then be chosen to be the next executive director for the WGIC, the World Geospatial Industry Council, which is what I'm doing today.
Interesting. And I'm guessing you probably still like what you do. So kind of give me an idea as far as when you were engineering, we'll talk about the engineering part of your career. What do you think were the big skill sets that you learned from the geospatial side that you helped carry you to the next level? And which ones do you still feel that you may draw upon?
I think first and foremost, the thing that I learned in those early days is that you have to put the work in. You have to put the time in. So one of the things that really, especially when I was teaching, that I really appreciated about GIS is that I don't think I've ever met anyone who was instantly good at GIS on day one, right? So you have to put the work in. If you're willing to put the work in, I think, I always would tell my students, if you put in the work, I think you'll feel very rewarded in what you do. The skills you learn in my classes will be things where even if this academic thing doesn't work out for you, you can go get a job tomorrow, right? That's true. I believe that. But nobody's instantly good at it. And that was a lesson that, of course, I had to learn on my own by staying up till 2 a.m., doing maps 3, 4, 7, 8 times before you got it right. And you were happy with the layout, with what happened. We were working with pin plotters back then. I can't even tell you how much Mylar I wasted and ran through the plotter trying to get something right.
Leroy lettering sets.
A Leroy lettering set, trying to doctor up CAD plots after they were already out of the machine. But you just have to have those experiences. I was also thankful to be on a survey crew at that time, which really allowed me to see all different dimensions of the data gathering from field to finish, is what we called it back then, on what that's going to look like, how that works, when it looks good in training or looks good in the manual, and then how it really works in the real world. To pull that off, you have to sort of change some things. And that was, all lessons learned, and something that I actually think about it quite a lot, and that I'm lucky to have had those experiences, because today's world, a lot of the people getting even GIS degrees, they may never ever go outside. They may never go into the field. And I don't see how that's possible, to be honest. I know it happens, and I know people are successful, but I just don't see how you can do that without seeing how it all starts and why it's important. I mean, we're mapping the world.
It's not just a point, it's not just a polygon.
Yeah,
there's something
there's something there, right? And it's not, when people say the point is the fire hydrant, but really the fire hydrant is the point. And so, if you don't understand why you do what you do, then you're likely to make some mistakes or make some shortcuts that don't work in your favor on downstream.
Because you're trying to convey that information through, through whether it's a hard copy map or on-screen map.
100%. So communication, I think, is sort of a lost piece in GIS education today, is that we haven't done a very good job of teaching the skills around taking all the wonderful maps and the analytics and everything, and how do you meaningfully communicate that to an audience. And that starts with understanding what happened in the field to begin with. That's going to become, I think, more important as we look to the future, because, I never talk to anybody who says, I wish I had less data, right? Everybody's always going to want more data, and we're really good at collecting data. I think if we're honest, we're not as good collectively at doing meaningful things with that data today.
I would agree.
So if we think about the last 20 years as sort of the era of data collection, the next 10 years are probably going to be more the era of data integration.
I think we have better tools now to help us extract more out of that existing data that's out there and allow us to build bigger data sets that have more meaning behind the same layers.
We do. And again, there's sometimes a disconnect between the raw data and what people really want. And a great example of that is LiDAR data. I hear people that come to me and say, I want LiDAR data. But what they really mean is I want better contours, or I want a better DTM, or they want a derivative of the LiDAR data. Because when you give them the raw LiDAR data, it crashes their laptop and they still don't know what happened, right? It's like, it's too much, right? And so they don't really want that raw data. What they want is a derivative. They want information, taking data, turning that into information, and then taking the information and turning that into an actionable item of some sort, like the why of it all. Why did we do this to start with? Mm-hmm. It's great that you can collect 40 million points a second or whatever, but why are you doing it? In service of what? And so when I look at GIS and geospatial outputs, be them vector, raster, some composite, I always try to put it through the sentence of in service of what? I'm doing all of this to answer a question, to make a decision, to do something else with the outputs of this.
You've kind of gone through this. You went working in the engineering world. Now you've done the WashU, the education side. Now, where you're at now, can you give me an idea? What's it like? What do you do? What's your driving force?
So the World Geospatial Industry Council, or WGIC, we are the only global nonprofit trade association for geospatial and Earth observation companies. And so we have now some 60 companies around the world. Big companies you've heard of, the Esris, the Trimbles, Bentley Hexagon, Oracle, TomTom, Wolpert, Fugro, et cetera, that are all sort of the big companies that
been
are
around a
well
long
known.
time now, right?
And then we've got about, about half of our membership, I'll say, are companies that have annual revenues of under $10 million. And so these tend to be more innovative, new companies that have a sensor, have an algorithm, have some data set that they're bringing to market. And it provides a really interesting mix, and in between those two, we have our corporate members, who are the companies that are bigger than a startup, but maybe not multi-billion-dollar companies. Mm-hmm. And so we have a very nice cross-section and representation of the industry. And I'm just thankful that I have that background to lean on from the practitioner side and engineering, from the education side and academia, and now from the nonprofit side, saying, okay, I'm afforded the perspectives of these other two viewpoints. Now I'm in a third viewpoint looking at the same industry. And what does it look like from over here? Because I know what it sort of looks like from those other two sides, and I know what the opportunities are, what the challenges are, what is important to them, and so forth in that environment. And now looking for ways to facilitate business opportunities, to demonstrate the value of geospatial on a global stage, to help people out, to make a difference through the activities of our organization, is very important to me, and that's what I'm passionate about.
Cool. And I think that gives you a really good rounded perspective with those three different perspectives there. Because you think about that, we have the training side, getting people start learning the technology and everything like that. That's key. But you also need that practical experience that you're talking about, because that helps define what the training needs to be to fill that role. But then you also have the other side that says, hey, okay, how do I help keep all this together? How do I make everything work? How do you do you find yourself still, I'm assuming it's true here, is how you work with the education realm still, and probably not just engineering, but that practical industry side?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that I've been working on for several years now. Sort of one of the interim steps that I took along the way was I was the executive director for the University Consortium for Geographic Information Science for a year just immediately prior to coming to WGIC. And that's a consortium of over 70 universities that teach geospatial. And so I was, again, another facet of this thing we call geospatial industry that I was afforded a look at from a unique role. The reality is that our research shows, and we're continuing this research, but there's a huge gap in workforce development and what the industry would call workforce ready students coming out of higher education. It's no secret, it's not a stretch to say that private industry runs at a different rate than higher education does. And in fact, that's actually about probably 4 or 5 to 1. So for every 5 iterations in the private industry, there's 1 iteration in higher ed.
Really?
So how do you train people in that model so that they can meet the demands of the industry on any given day? And the research that we've done to date, just doing a sample size out of LinkedIn job postings and platforms like Indeed, looking at the geospatial job openings globally, on any given day, you can go out there and find over 20,000 job openings. Those aren't jobs in the industry. Those are job openings in the industry.
Wow.
In the next 5 years, that number is going to double. And so by 2030, there'll be over 40,000 job openings today, over 80,000 in 5 years. Right? Wow. And so
that's a lot of opportunity.
That's a lot of opportunity. Unfortunately, whenever you look at the higher ed side, you see that they're only putting out maybe 20,000 students a year. And so when you sort of model all of these things out through economics, what you find is that the industry grows at a rate of around 11 or 12%, something like that, year over year. Higher education grows at a rate of 2%.
Oh, wow.
So that problem doesn't get better with time.
Right.
Those lines are diverging. And so the real opportunity, even for companies like yours, is what happens between the supply and the demand. It's great that we have all the higher education programs. Everybody says they're doing a good job. There's just not enough of it. Around the world, if you take all of higher education that teaches geospatial, you're at around 500 universities, something like that. If you think about the largest university anywhere that's graduating geospatial professionals, how many a year would they graduate? 10, 20, something like that?
Probably not that many, really.
And so let's put them all together then. Let's be very optimistic. They're all going to graduate 20 times 500. I'm not getting to 80,000. I'm not getting to the numbers that I need. So it's going to take everything that we're doing there, but it's also going to take initiatives in community colleges. It's also going to take initiatives with non-credit education. It's going to take initiatives that meet people early career, second career, et cetera, at all entry points. Sort of think about it as a continuum of talent. It's like, how can we bring more people in to serve this industry? Because when people go around talking about concepts like digital twins, you don't do that without having that talent pipeline coming in to support it. And you and I are of an age that maybe when we started out, there wasn't a thing called GIS as a degree. You sort of had to figure out what would that look like. And when I talk to students today and I say, I'm sold, how do I get a degree in digital twin? Nobody can answer that question.
I think the other thing is we really need to be able to define what that digital twin really is. That's where I think people struggle with too, when they're trying to, I want to get that degree in a digital twin. What is that? How do you do that?
Yeah, so you have to wrap some context around that. And digital twin is going to mean different things to different people. I think, the part of it that's interesting to me is that where do we draw lines between something like BIM, building information modeling, which we've been doing since the mid-90s, right, and a digital twin? Isn't that really a digital twin? Where's the line between a GIS and a digital twin? Where's the line between paper maps and a digital twin? And so one of the things that I try, if I go and just talk to digital twin topics to an audience, especially young adults, they may sit there politely and even be excited about it. But what oftentimes they'll say is that that's great, but that's not for me. That can't possibly be for me. It's too complicated. And what you have to do then, getting back to our communication topic, is think about how do you help people see themselves in this thing called digital twin on this journey, depending if they're on the technical side, on the management side, on the decision maker side of this. Like, why do I even want a digital twin? And so understanding what problems does a digital twin solve or potentially address becomes an important part of that, and defining that context, but helping people see themselves in it. And I would argue that even if all you have are scanned maps, CAD files, 2D CAD files, you're some way along the journey to digital twin already. You're not starting from scratch. Right. That's the good news. And we need to do a better job of articulating that to people, to, not just to say the digital twin's the next big thing, but here's why. Here's actual problems that digital twins help us solve. And maybe it'll wind up being called a digital twin. Maybe it'll be wind up called something else. And that's okay. But we're all doing this in service of, making the world a better place through geospatial technologies, utilizing data to support decision-making, outputs, be them graphical or non-graphical. Right. A lot of times people forget that it's okay to have things coming out of your geospatial right. system that aren't maps, for Correct. Example, right? Maps are certainly an important part, but they're not the only part. And so
I would say maps a lot of times are the byproduct of the real work.
Yeah, so they're a derivative of the work, right? And we used to say, and I think this even goes back to Roger Tomlinson's book around thinking about GIS, where he said, data is over 70% of GIS. If you've got all the right data, making the maps is the easy part, right? You're not going to fight an uphill battle as much in doing that. And so we've got to understand how to build these systems. And again, getting back to integration, if you're going to integrate sensor networks, your heating and air conditioning to your digital twin, your lighting plan, all these different systems, you really do need to know integration. And I think, to continue that Photoshop analogy we talked about earlier, what are all the things that you're going to have to know to be really good at digital twins that aren't going to be taught in a classroom? And then once you even know those things, how are you going to get those skills? Are those going to be the on-the-job skills? Will there be training developed around some of those skills? And I think, we're going to find that out here in the next several years.
Interesting. So as your position as the executive director at WGIC, is this what you get to share with the universities, the education institutions, I guess, as well as other industries? Is that what you're kind of doing?
So we develop reports on very technical topics like GeoAI. And one of the things that we say at WGIC is it's an opportunity for the industry to speak with one voice. So take a topic like metaverse. Metaverse is sort of a loaded word now for different reasons, but the metaverse means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Our member companies came and said, we'd like to stake out some ground. We'd like to articulate what metaverse means to the geospatial industry. And so they commissioned and did the research and wrote a report on geospatial and metaverse. And that turned out to be a really popular report, because all of a sudden people said, here's some solid ground that I can stand on. I may not agree with all of it, but It's solid ground I can stand on to explore the rest of this idea called metaverse. Or they may look at AI and say, why is that relevant to geospatial? Well, here's some applications, here's some considerations, here's some red flags, here's the good and the bad of it all. But we also work in the areas of policy. We work in areas of academia. How can universities and industry work closer together? So if you go and talk to people in industry, they'll say, we're not getting the right students with the right skills coming out of school. But if I go and talk to a university, they'll say, well, nobody from the industry ever comes to talk to us, right? So y'all need you need to get together, right? And
it's that communication.
So we spend time in that space too. It's like, how can we build opportunities? How can we convene what we sometimes call improbable conversations? How do we bring these two different worlds together in service of meeting the workforce, demands in our industry? How do we get that iterative cycle to run more efficiently? How do we make sure that the students coming out of a program are going to have jobs, that they are employable, right? And those things require both sides to put some work in order to meet somewhere in the middle.
So through our conversation here, ended up talking about like the digital twin side. Going back early on, you see how technology's changed over the years, and we've both experienced, not just GIS technology. Technology in general has really changed, which then affects GIS along with other industries as well. But geospatial is very technology driven. Seeing where things were, can you kind of tell me where you think things are, what were some of the major revolutions that you saw from your early years to kind of where you were in the education side to where you're at now, and kind of where you think are going to be some of the, upcoming ones?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to be able to take a step back and look perhaps a little more broadly, certainly more broadly and hopefully more objectively at the entire ecosystem that we call geospatial, because it's not only changing, but it's changing rapidly. And what, we maybe spent a lot of time on doing previously, like digitizing, I might not need to do that anymore. And I think that's going to be accelerated through tools like AI, for example. I tried to graph this out one time, and I wound up with sort of this profile of a mountain, and about a third of the way up of the mountain, I drew a plateau that I wound up calling the points, lines, and polygons plateau. It's like when we all started out with GIS, we weren't very good at it. And then we all got up to where we felt like we were pretty good at points, lines, and polygons. And sort of we're all dancing around here, patting ourselves on the back, saying we're really good at points, lines, and polygons. But what we're not acknowledging is that the mountain continues up, right? And so what comes after that?
Right.
And I think, right now what we're seeing are not only new advances in higher resolution and different types of data capture. I mean, what happens when all of my polygons are derivatives of scans, and that I don't really need to digitize that anymore as a discrete element? Those are the kinds of things I see automation coming for first. I think there'll be a pivot to more value on discernment. You collect all this data, so what? What do I do with it? What does it mean? Sort of the analyst level, the next level of looking at data. I find it very interesting to travel. I'm fortunate to travel around the world and see what's happening in different regions. And I can go to certain regions of the world and say, okay, they're advanced. They're ahead of what's happening in Europe or in the United States, North America market. And then usually follows the things I see in somewhere like the Middle East, I'll see 18 months later in the U.S. market. Right?
Wow.
So I can go to the Middle East today, and I can tell you projects that are using hyperspectral imagery on a daily basis. That doesn't happen in the U.S.
And what do you think the reasoning is behind that?
I think there's a couple things in play. I think, one of it is the willingness to adopt. The systems there aren't as mature, typically, meaning they haven't been around for 30, 40 years. So you don't have
They're
to
not set in
have,
their ways.
They're not set in their ways. They're open to new ideas. Some of them have more financial resources than organizations in the U.S. might have. But whatever those things are, I've not been anywhere where I see more advanced projects than what's called the MENA region or the Middle East region of the world. Having said that, they may be behind on other aspects of things. So it's not like they're just wholesale, better than or ahead, but there are elements to be drawn from every market around the world on how people are addressing challenges and what that means to them. And certainly the U.S. is a leader in that, but I think being willing to look at what other people are doing and draw from that. Digital twins that we were just talking about are a much bigger deal in Europe than they are in the United States, for example. But there's a very different sort of government processes, footprint, whatever you want to call that, in that region of the world than we have in the U.S. And maybe we just haven't done as good a job at articulating the value of that within this market. But people are doing it. If I'm an airport and I have FAA regs that I need to follow, I'm following a digital twin. If I'm a big developer, maybe I have a digital twin. of my development and so forth. So there are examples of that I think are early indicators of where things are headed. But the AI, the automation, all of these kinds of tools, I think are going to come for that data creation piece first. And so, when I talk to people about sort of future-proofing their GIS career, I always tell them to look at things that AI can't do and probably won't be able to do for the foreseeable future, and discernment and understanding the why of something is a piece of that I think future-proofs them for the foreseeable future.
Interesting. So I think another thing that I find interesting about your career path is I think it highlights the fact that when we talk about GIS, geospatial, we mentioned it earlier, we're kind of past just GIS. We're more in the geospatial realm, which is, to me, is a little broader. But I think that people need to realize that it's not just always a technical job. It's not always, I need to use this one piece of software. You mentioned earlier, there's Adobe, Photoshop. You might be using something like that. There's other tools that are out there that people need to understand depending on what their job is. And then there's also the data side from the technical part. You got the analytical side. You have the automation side, which is very huge. How do we make all these capabilities easier to use? But then where you're at now, you kind of have that business side where you have to look at the policies. You have to look at how do we pull all this together. And I think that's where you're at right now. You kind of get that ability to see and pull that at a higher level. And I'm guessing you get to work with people at that higher level. And do you find that there's still that, I guess, a bit of a mystery about what geospatial is when you get the chance to talk to the leadership level?
Well, it can vary. I think you have to acknowledge at some point that some of the things you thought were a big deal aren't a big deal in the big scheme of things. And one of the areas where we're working actively right now is understanding the connections between the geospatial activities of an organization or a country and then the enterprise functions of that company, right? So you take a big engineering company, you take a big commercial company of some sort, a real estate company, or even more recently during the pandemic, you look at what was happening in geospatial and then the whole decision-making layer that's at the governor's office or something that's above that. How do we improve the connections between the geospatial things, which oftentimes are bottom up,
right,
and where they interface or where their touch points are with that sort of enterprise level? How does GIS, so another way to think about that from a technical perspective is not how does Microsoft Office integrate with GIS, but how does GIS integrate with Microsoft Office? Because the Microsoft Office implementation at any organization is going to be much larger than whatever they've got going on with GIS, right? So this recognition that there are a whole range of IT activities that are at a higher level than anything happening in geospatial, and yet geospatial needs to understand its touch points to where it can fit into those business processes. Why do we do what we do? Mm-hmm. How do I use this fancy tool and all this data, hardware, software, algorithms, sensors? How do I use those as a differentiator in my business, whatever that is? It might be agriculture, it might be supply chain, it might be real estate, it might be any number of things that we talk about. It might be an insurance company. How does an insurance company differentiate on geospatial? Because insurance companies are uniquely one of the only industries, perhaps, that every single asset has got a location.
Right.
Everything that they do has a location, right? And yet go to any GIS conference and tell me how many insurance companies you see there. There aren't any. Right. And so why is that? And how do we build bridges between that industry and, and our industry? Not just for use cases, but also on the business side.
I would agree. Very interesting. So you've kind of covered a lot of ground as far as your career. You got a chance to, and I think that's one of the things I find about the geospatial industry is you can apply it to so many different other industries and so many different, you don't have a direct career path. And I think that's one of the things I'm hoping that the viewers and listeners get to hear about this is to realize that it's wide open.
Yeah.
Once you get in this career path, there's so many things you get to do. And it's easy, if you don't want to get pigeonholed, this is a good industry to do it. You can really broaden your spectrum. So looking back now that you've kind of transitioned at a lot of different phases here, what was probably maybe one of your more or maybe a couple, if you have, some of the interesting projects that you found that you applied geospatial? Was there any of them that stood out to you that was like, that was pretty, I never thought about it, but that was a good project?
Oh yeah, it's what we sometimes call type 2 fun. It wasn't fun while you were doing it, but when you look back at it, it's very interesting. I think in 1995 we were awarded a contract after the floods on the Mississippi and Missouri River. Congress mandated a resounding of the Missouri River from St. Louis at the mouth all the way to Yankton, South Dakota, which is the end of the navigable channel is what it's called. It's the first big dam across the Missouri River. That's river miles. That's around 750 miles or more. And in that project, we took a cross section of the riverbed every 500 feet for 750 miles.
Wow.
And the data reduction all fell on my responsibility, as did the drafting of the hydrographic plates. But I reduced over 22 million data points in spreadsheet programs for that 750 miles, and then hand contoured 750 miles of river. So I got very familiar with that processes, and then also the contouring and teaching myself how to contour with river soundings versus the way contouring works above water. So that, I think, was a very, very early example of it. And honestly, I'm just thankful for the cross-section of projects that I've been fortunate enough to work on, whether it's a large, resort in Las Vegas, or if it's working on sidewalk repair for a small town in Southern Illinois. And really, there's something to be learned on every one of those projects along the way. And I think that's the important part. As I started teaching and looking back on my experiences as a practitioner, one of the things that I would tell the students, much to their dismay often, is on the first day of class, I would say, look, this is a GIS class, but I said, honestly, I don't really care if you learn GIS or not. So what I need you to learn is a set of frameworks, an approach, a way of thinking to work on problems that don't have easy answers, to be okay with not having the answer at the end of the day, but having enough energy and enough passion and drive to come back tomorrow morning, pick up where you left off, and keep working on it. And I said, if you can learn that, the buttons may change, the software may change, but if you can learn that way of thinking, that will serve you well in this profession and other areas of your life for as long as you want to do this.
I totally agree with that. I think it kind of goes with the whole, GIS is more than the software. That the software is a tool for the GIS practitioner. Yeah. And you have multiple tools that you can use. So there's multiple software, multiple tools out there. So I totally agree with that concept. I think that's a good thing for students to really grasp. It will make them a much better job prospect down the way. So I think one other thing I'd kind of look at here, where do you see yourself in the next few years? What's your goals now?
My goal is to lift the industry up and to build a community. I agreed to do that for a period of time for this organization. I see opportunities that come along here and there, things that are interesting. The education thing's still interesting to me, even though I'm not immersed in that world anymore. The practitioner side of it is interesting. The mentoring side of it's interesting to me. Because I know that at some point I'm not going to want to do this anymore. Transition into a different chapter of life, and I want to see good things happen not only for the industry, but more importantly for the people coming into the industry, because there is a huge need, and finding meaningful ways to address that need is something that I feel urgency around. Because you can't double the size of an industry and not have a pipeline of talent
Right.
to come in and support that industry. So I think working somehow in that space or around that space is probably what I'll find myself doing for the foreseeable future.
I think there's plenty of opportunity in that realm as well.
Absolutely.
So a lot of times when we have guests here to do this, a question I like to end up is, what would be your advice? I think you've given a lot of advice, things for people to think about just getting into the industry. But is there anything you'd like to add? So you're just kind of starting out in the industry, whether you're a student or, to me, I think also the early career entry. You've been doing geospatial work maybe for a couple of years. Is there anything else you'd like to maybe give them some advice on what they should think about? Or
I think advice in two different ways. From the student side, showing up and being willing to do whatever needs to be done is first and foremost. Because a lot of people have a preconceived notion about what that means to them, and they perhaps hang on to that a little too tightly, and that doesn't work in their favor. But moreover, I think on the management side, the people who are hiring young people, is to give them a chance to succeed, not guarantee success, but give them an opportunity to succeed. Do not set them up to fail. And what I see, unfortunately, when I look around at employers, more often than I would like, are their employees are being set up to fail. Like, there's just no chance they were ever going to be successful at the task you gave them because you didn't understand the task to begin with. And so, if you want to build a strong team, a high-performing team, I think what you have to do is create situations that give your team an opportunity to succeed. That does not mean it's easy. That does not mean it will be 100% successful, but give them an opportunity, something that is doable, and don't just, throw them out there and then complain if they don't deliver.
I totally agree with that as well. Well, I think you've covered a lot of ground. I think you've given a lot of things for people to think about, which is great. And I think we'll kind of wrap it up here. But if people have more questions, they'd like to get a hold of you, how would somebody, reach out to you? How would you like them to reach out to you?
Absolutely. So they can reach out to me at Aaron.Addison at WGICouncil.org, or they can look me up on social media. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on some of the other social media platforms. So be happy to chat.
Awesome. We'll make sure we put that in the show notes as well so people can get a hold of you.
Perfect.
Well, Aaron, I greatly appreciate your time, and hopefully we'll get you back in here and we'll have some more deeper conversations, because I know there's a lot more there we could talk about. We have several different topics I think we could greatly expand on. But for I think this episode, we kind of got a chance to learn about who you were, how your path was. I think everybody will enjoy that, and greatly appreciate your time.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us on the Spatial Connection podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on your favorite platform. You can also follow us on social media and visit our website for updates, resources, and behind-the-scenes content. Do you know someone with a fascinating geospatial story? If so, send us a message. We'd love to hear about them. Until next time, stay curious, stay connected, and keep exploring the world through the lens of geospatial technology.